So for the Millions Learning Report that we launched at Brookings last year, we basically surveyed the literature and we did a deep dive into 14 case studies to try to identify if there were some common patterns or underlying factors that appeared to be contributing to large-scale progress in education, to basically scaling up quality education. What were some of those common factors in the literature and through these case studies from around the world? And we found that across the board, this was certainly reinforced in the literature, but we also saw this in the cases that we looked at, that the need to design an initiative, whether a program or a policy, whether designed by a state or a non-state actor, that it was imperative to design it based on local demand. That required really engaging and involving the community from the very start, and basing it on what the community wanted. And this was an important distinction, not necessarily what practitioners or policymakers or funders thought the communities needed, but what they actually wanted. And this also required building in local accountability. And I think this is a very obvious point to make in terms of, we're talking about community participation. It's sort of development 101, but you would be surprised how many countless examples there really were where very well-intentioned, meaningful initiatives didn't take this into account from the start. And I think one really poignant example came from BRAC. As you might know, BRAC is considered one of the largest, if not the largest, private secular education program in the world. It's responsible for approximately 5% of primary school enrollment in Bangladesh alone. And BRAC very bravely and generously shared that when they first started out in the early 1970s, they started with an adult literacy center in a rural area in Bangladesh. And they opened up this center, and what they did is they provided literacy classes for non-literate adults to come in after a day of work. And they found that after 18 months of this program, they only had a retention rate of 5%. And they're wondering, why is this? And what they realized was that this program initially, this literacy center, had been designed and developed based on what senior managers at BRAC thought was needed, rather than what the community actually wanted. And when they went back and surveyed the community, they found what they actually wanted to learn after a long, hard day of work, working in the field, was they wanted to learn about subjects that were much more relevant to their daily life: health, nutrition, animal husbandry. And so they found that they needed to make that switch. Another example is we looked at a practice known as lesson study. This is a practice that originated in Japan and has now been adapted to more than 50 countries around the world. And what it is, it's a peer-to-peer teacher learning approach where teachers learn from one another, developing, practicing lesson plans, critiquing and providing guidance to one another. And what lesson study, when we looked at it in Zambia, and what the government officials who are implementing the program shared with us, is the crucial element for them was teacher buy-in. That it was critical to engage teachers from the start, and how they approached it was not what teachers were lacking and that teachers were the recipient of a training program, but really from an empowerment standpoint, that recognizing that teachers themselves were able to identify what was needed to improve their own teaching, and that was really critical in the success of lesson studies expansion throughout all of Zambia. Across all of the cases we looked at, data played a central role. And it was interesting. I think it was data in various forms. Oftentimes we think of data perhaps as just experimental, scientifically designed evaluations, and certainly rigorous impact evaluations played a critical role. But it was also data in terms of qualitative data, in terms of student testimonial, in terms of witnessing change firsthand. So it was really data in a wide variety of forms that really played an important role, I would say, in three ways. The first, in terms of motivating action, really sounding an alarm bell that there was a crisis at hand, in this case a learning crisis in many countries. Second, in terms of designing initiatives, that it was really critical for driving continuous improvement. And thirdly, sustaining action. We know that oftentimes initiatives are dependent upon particular champions, and particularly when those champions might leave office or leave positions, there goes the initiative with it. And so when you had data to demonstrate that real change was not only possible, but was happening, therefore it becomes something that's very difficult to reverse. It becomes expected and demanded by communities. To give one example, one thing that we found and where data played a critical role was in this sort of design phase, as I mentioned, driving continuous improvements. And I think what was clear from our study, from Millions Learning, is that scaling is not a linear process. It's not as though you grow something from small to big or bigger to biggest, but it's really a question of this process of learning, of testing, of refining, of continuous course corrections and adjustments, and that part of that and what's integral to that is data. And so Pratham is one of the case studies we looked at, which is one of the largest education NGOs in India. For Pratham and the expansion of, in particular, the remedial education program across India, they found that data was central. And it was data in terms of the experimentation at the field level and testing different approaches in terms of implementing this teaching at the right level approach. But then it was also combined with the rigorous evaluations. And in this case, it's more than a decade-long partnership with the JPAL to really show the results. And as the CEO of Pratham has shared, Rukmini Banerjee, she said, for us, what was critical for data in our system, that data in our system was most important for us. It wasn't to report to a donor, it wasn't to necessarily show results to a policymaker, but it was really to continuously feedback and drive improvements in their programs. So I think a real tension that we found from the beginning when we started the research from Millions Learning was, how do you maintain fidelity to the model, to a quality intervention, and at the same time expand and grow and adapt to other contexts. So it's this question of, fidelity versus, we know that context is paramount. And what we found, for the most part, is that many of these interventions that had successfully expanded while maintaining its impact achieved something that we refer to as flexible adaptation. And what that meant was we found this optimal point between adherence to some of the core principles or non-negotiable aspects of that initiative, while at the same time recognizing the other pieces that not only could be, but really needed to be adapted to the local context. And it really meant identifying what were those core elements that were really driving the improvements, again, in this case, the learning gains among children or young people, and what were those aspects that really needed to be adapted. So it wasn't as though you had this very rigid model that was sort of unfurled around the world, nor did you necessarily have the situation on the other end of the spectrum where you had this very intensive, costly process of customization for each location. But again, it was identifying those non-negotiables that should look the same and the other pieces to be adapted. So to give an example, one of the cases we looked at was Aflatoon. And Aflatoon provides financial and social education for children and young people in more than 116 countries around the world. And so for Aflatoon, again, in trying to adapt this training program being implemented by governments, by UN agencies, by non-governmental organizations, a host of different actors in a variety of contexts, they found that they had, I'd say, 3 core components, and that those looked the same. So for example, the first for them was that the themes of both social and financial education needed to be included. But how that was implemented was very much left up to those who were doing implementation. Secondly, that it needed to take a whole child-centered approach and really a sort of participatory approach to the training. And thirdly was the idea that you really needed to leverage the talent and assets of all actors involved. That it wasn't just, UNICEF who was implementing, or it wasn't just a government agency, or it wasn't just this one NGO, but it was really recognizing the need to engage the teachers, the parents, the communities, the policymakers, all of those that were involved in the teaching and learning process. I think another example that folks are familiar with, or more familiar with perhaps, is Sesame Workshop. And Sesame Workshop, as many of you might know, is the largest informal educator of young children today. It's in more than 150 countries, reaching millions of children. It's been around for more than 40 years. And what's interesting about Sesame Street is, again, for them, the core components are, there's a universal style, regardless of the production and regardless of what country, there is that fuzzy, lovable Muppet. It might look different in Nigeria versus Bangladesh versus Colombia, but there is those Muppet characters. So you have the universal style. You have the target age group of children 3 to 5, and you have the whole child approach. But beyond that, Sesame Workshop really leaves it up to the local production teams in each of those countries where it works to develop the programming, be it print, TV, radio, digital, depending on the needs of children in those countries and the national education goals. And so again, I think time and time again we saw both in the literature and the cases this need to have this flexible adaptation approach.